today. Our topic of discussion is the REST API and how REST API works in SMAX. So for that, in terms of the agenda, a few topics we would like to discuss. One is an overview of the REST API. Where do you find more information? And then we'll drill down in a few examples how to configure and use a REST client accessing the EMS REST API using a REST client, and then as well managed person REST. Okay, so few things we would like to cover, and would like to point out that majority of the information you will actually find it in the help center. It's a good place to start, and from here you can go to the developer reference, and in here you have the list of all the REST API in detail, explaining how to set them up and how to use them. So the main one is the entity management service, which allows you to perform simple operations of creating a record, reading a record, or updating one or multiple records. Then we have some specialized APIs, like for example the Analytics API, which allows you to retrieve information about reports, Managed Persons for managing users and contacts, Business Intelligence for retrieving information from SMAX and using them in a third-party business intelligence tool, Case Exchange for exchanging record information with an external system, and then some maybe advanced like managing the encryption domains if you set up a number of custom fields that are encrypted, or operations on comments. A few things to mention that probably come up, we've seen them coming up frequently, is about the REST API. So this is the only one supported. We don't support SOAP in SMAX. In terms of BI integration, you can use the REST API. No direct access to the database, although stay tuned for more details as we are adding capabilities around Postgres views that will allow you another way to get into the system and get information from the database. And there is no need to use the on-premise bridge for this. You just call the REST API directly. So one thing to bring up, you have very useful information in addition to the Help Center, is the SMAX configuration guide that's available for download from the community. It's available in a PDF format, and we'll be soon releasing it in an ebook format as well. So you see here some of the highlights and topics of discussion. So what we'll be covering in this particular session are these three topics related to the REST APIs. So how do you configure and use Postman REST client? So what we'll be doing today is really trying to use as much as we can the information that's already available for us, and I'm going to be pointing to the configuration guide, and we'll just jump to the chapter here, and just cover this. So there are multiple REST clients, and this is just one example. You don't have to choose this one. there are other available, so we just picked one that's relatively used in the team, and we'll share the information with you. So the way you go, you just go to the Chrome browser, and from there to the extensions, and look for the uh, extensions available, and one in particular is this Postman. Once you install it, and I'm just going to turn it on, and I'm going to show it to you. So once you install it, you just go to your application, and you open the window. What's important is to turn on the interceptor, right? So this needs to be turned on. And once this is on, then it will allow you to exchange the credentials with the browser you're in, so you're already authenticated in the same session as your browser. Okay, so once you have this up and running, what is important is to be able to find the URL of the master node and the tenant ID, because this is what you'll be using to write the URLs that allow you to call the various REST APIs. And this is very simple. You just go to your main window you have open, and you notice here you have the URL and the tenant ID, right? So this is the information that you need after that in order to be able to build the various REST APIs. Okay, so let's give it a try then, and we'll see how it works. One thing to note, and not as much for the get, but mostly for the post commands. There are two headers that you need to add, and they are listed here in the documentation. The content type and the user agent. Okay, so this is something that you just add in here, right, as the header, and then you're all set. Okay, so let's take just a very simple example we have prepared here to see how the REST API works. Okay. So what we have here, you notice here we have the URL, right, as we mentioned, the same as from your main browser, and then the tenant ID. Followed by the EMS, which is the name of the main API we'll be using in most of the examples today. And what we're trying to do here is really to do a simple query where we retrieve all the requests that are in this tenant, and what we want to do is retrieve a number of fields from this request, right? So in this case, what we have is the ID, the display label, which is the title and the description. And we'll just do this simple query, which then will, as you can see here, it returns the information for each record. It gives you the description, the ID, the display label, and it does return a few other fields that are there all the time, like the last update time. And if you scroll down at the bottom, you will see you have the count of all the records retrieved. Next. Okay. If we get there, I seem to have an issue with the browser. Okay, so that's just a simple example. Now, let's try to maybe add a few more fields to this query, and then as well a filter. Right? So I have an example here. I'm just going to copy in the in the URL, and then we'll explain what we did here. So in addition to the ID, the display label, and the description we had before, now we want to retrieve a few more fields. So in this case, I'm adding the creation time, and then the assignee. But I don't want just the assignee ID, right, which is an entity link. I also want to return the name of the assignee. So for that, we're using the syntax where we use the field name followed by a dot, and then the descriptor for that field from the person record, and in this case, the name. And I also wanted to add a priority. And I don't want to get all the fields, all the records retrieved. So I also added a filter in this case, and I have a filter on priority, right? And for the priority, I just want to get the high priority records, okay? So in this case, as you can see here, we do have now the additional fields returned, including the assigned to persons, right? So this is the assignee, this is the ID that's stored in the request entity. But then as well, we have the additional information about the assignee, which is the name. But this comes in a special section of the data under the related property, because the name of the person, it's not stored in the main request entity, but it is coming from the person record through the entity link. Okay, so this is how the data is usually returned in a JSON format. But what we also can do in some cases, if you need a different format, so I have the same query as before of CSV in the URL. And if I do that, all of a sudden we will see the information retrieved in a different format, which in some situations may be easier to consume. It all depends what you plan to do with the data. The only thing I would say with the CSV format that should be mentioned is you will not be able to return rich text fields or large text fields, right? So you notice even if I put in here the description, when the result shows up, it does not have the description field. The rich text fields, you can only get them with the JSON format. Okay, so let's go back to the slides for a minute and see what we have in here. So a few things. I would say some tips. You can return up to 10,000 records in an EMS query, right? So what's important is you will notice that if you have a system where you have more than 10,000 records in a table, you'll get an error when you run the REST API. So what you need to do in that case is to add a filter that will allow you to narrow down the result to be below 10K. And this applies to paging as well. So paging, even if you do paging, right, where you retrieve a subset, the paging will work inside that 10,000 limit. So you still have to get down to 10,000 before you can do paging. By default, the batch result is 250 records, right? So if you don't put a size attribute on the request, it will by default return 250 even if you have more than that, right? So In that case, what is important is to make sure you check at the bottom of the results page, and depending on the number of results, if you see you have more than 250, then you should increase the page size. So if I go back here and run this query and scroll down, you see here total count, right? So this is the value that tells you how many records are in total in that response to your REST query. So a few other tips. We already saw the example. So if you want to get information on the fields which are entity links, by default, if you just put the field name, you get the ID of the record in the other table. But with the dot notation, you can access other fields from the related records. And the many-to-many relations are invoked differently. So that's not something you can run this way, and we'll also look at how that's done in a minute. Okay, so I'm gonna pause here before the next section. Dean, are there any questions people may have we need to cover?
Hey, Brindusa, I have a question about permissions. Are there specific permissions for the user that's executing these gets and posts within HP that needs to be provided?
I would say there are no special permissions for the REST API. The user will inherit the permission they have in the system, right? So, for example, if the user is entitled to access only request management because the role is set so it has permissions on request. When they execute the query, they will get the request. But if they try to execute a query on another entity, they wouldn't be able to return the results. Right? So it follows the permission that's already defined inside the tool.
Okay, and then if you don't mind, just sort of building onto that or preceding that, in an actual application programming environment,
Right.
Where you're not using Postman and synchronizing or intercepting the credentials.
Yes.
How does that differ?
Okay, so for that, let me switch to the documentation. I think we do have. Let me see if we have. We do have. Yes. Okay. So the way it works is you actually have to send an initial REST API, which is an authentication query, right? And it's the same as the other one, right? You have the main URL, right, with URL slash, so, and then authentication, authenticate endpoint. It's a post request, right? And then in the body, you put the username and password of your account, and then the response will be a token, right, like this, okay? And then you take this token and you add it in your next regular request that goes out. So I may actually, let me see if I have an example. Let me quickly see. I probably have an example. Right, so I have this example that looks right. So let me just bring it up in a notepad. I'm gonna put it on. So if I do like, so I'm just gonna, this is like, oops, gonna remove the password for a minute. You could use something like this. This would be like a curl, which is a get. This is a get, but you can also do a post, right? So I showed you the post, but it also works with a get. And then your next request will look something like this. Second, put it in the notepad, right? So it will be, let's say the first one, it returned a big token, which then you pass it as an LWSSO cookie key, and then followed by your REST API. Right? So this is just an example with just curl code from the command line. You can do the same with Perl, with Java, with any other language you feel comfortable with. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So if there are no other questions, let's maybe show a few examples of updates. Okay, so what we'll do here now, let's pick the example of a person record. We'll just go to the request to the person grid in here, and I don't know. Let's just pick this one. So Alice. We have the information in here, and we decide we want to change the first name for Alice to let's say Amanda, and we'll add myself as the manager for this person. Right. So as you can see here, there is no manager at this point. Okay. So let's bring up again the REST client, and in general, all your updates will be done using this bulk REST API, REST syntax, and we'll just do. Oops, I just need to put this way, and then we need to put the body in here. So I'm just gonna clear what I had before. And we'll add the body in here. So in this case, what I'm doing is I want to update the person entity, and I want to, so the operation is update, and I want to change the first name to Amanda and the manager to this ID, which is my user. And I'm doing this for the record, which has the ID 10190, which is this one. Okay. So we'll just send the request. We get a response, the successful. And if I go back in here and refresh this page, we'll see here that the first name is Amanda, now, and in the organizational information, I'm now the manager. Okay, so I've done this for a simple case with just one record, but you can add here as many records as you like. I would say, obviously there is a limit on the overall payload, but you can add the different records in here in this array structure. Now let's try to create two records. We'll do so. I'm gonna copy here these two very simple records. We don't have a lot of information, just a few fields, and let's see what happens if I click on the send button. So what you see in the response here, if we scroll down, is that the first one went actually has a failure because it tells me that the name should not be empty, right? So it only worked for the first one, sorry, and then for the second one, but the first one didn't go through because I was missing a mandatory field. So it's important also to check the response, right, and make sure that you don't have errors in the response, right? Okay, and then let's take another example of adding a person to a group, right? This would be a many-to-many relation. So let's go back to our grid, and we'll pick a user, and doesn't matter, we'll just pick any, let's pick Cynthia, and this is ID 16159, okay? And what we'll do is we'll add this person to the Cool Cakes group. So right now you see here there are two people in this group. So let me just take the payload we want to use. Okay, so this is a bit different, right? Because we are now looking at a relationship. We're not looking at an entity like before with a person. We're looking at a relationship. And there are two ends on the relationship, right? There is the first endpoint, which is on the person side. And then there is a second endpoint, which is on the group side, right? And then the name of the relation is person to group. So we do put the two IDs, one on the person, one on the group. And then once we hit enter, oops, yeah, we had an issue. Let me quickly see if I had the wrong ID or something. Oh, 10730. Okay, I must have taken from another one. 10730. Okay. Okay, so it tells me in this case that I cannot do it because there is already a relationship created. So we must affect, means the person already has a group. So let's quickly check. No. 16159. Oh, 16159. Sorry. That's the problem. Okay, so we successfully added this person. So now if I refresh, we see the group. Okay, it's already added. So that would be a way to add memberships. Okay, so that's the what we wanted to cover for the EMS API. So let's quickly go through One other thing on the second API we wanted to cover, which is the managed person API. And this is really for managing users and contacts. And you have very good detailed information both in the guide. If you go there to page 123, it goes into the details on how to add a contact, how to update contacts, adding users, updating users, adding group membership, and so on. So I'm just going to show a quick example on how we do this. And the API we'll be using is a different one. So let's switch to, so it's still a post, right? So the new API is called Manage Person, so UMS Manage Person. And I'm going to add here the payload. Okay, so in this case, what I'm doing is I'm creating a contact, right? So I mark it as my user is false. This is an indication it's a contact. Otherwise, it would be a user. And I put a few fields: first name, last name, phone number, the manager, and some roles. And let's hit send. So the response is a job ID. So the difference compared to the EMS API is this API is actually an asynchronous API. So it gets executed behind the scenes by a special task that takes this job IDs in order, and especially if you have more than one user you create, it may take some time to perform the request. So what we need to do now is actually go in and check what happened to it. So we'll have to run a status query. We just need this ID. We'll append. And what it's telling me is that it finished adding the request. But it has some errors, and this is because one of the roles I had in there, role 1, doesn't exist, right? And that was intentional. I wanted to do this to show it. But let's see what happened now on the system. So if I go back here, and I'll go here and just do, see if what we added today. You would see that we have added some users. One came from our previous request on the EMS API, right? It was a simple request we added, and this is our second one, this Rob Smith. And then if we go to the detail page, we see the name and then the phone numbers as well. So going back quickly to the slide, few things to mention. The maximum bulk size supported is 100 records. You'll be able to add or update up to 100 records in one pass. So if you are in a configuration where you are not using the email as the UPN, the unique identifier on the person, you have to set this property, this attribute, UPN data type, to customer ID, and it's all described in the help. So by default, a record will be created as a user. If you just want to create contacts, then you can set this flag to false. In the payload, and I'm just going to show you the payload here, it's going to be easier to do it looking at an example. So in a payload, you do have information about the roles, the license, but then as well groups, right? And groups can be added in two ways. You can add them in general as groups, right? Like this. Or if you wanted to distinguish between functional and organizational groups, then you can use the other syntax with functional groups and organizational groups that allows you a bit more flexibility and granularity on to maybe, just making changes to your functional groups, but not touching the organizational group. And as I mentioned, the REST API runs asynchronous, so don't forget to retrieve the job status, right? Keep the job ID and then run a get to check the job status. And if it returns with errors, make sure you review the errors and you take the relevant action. Okay, so that's what we prepared for today. I'm going to open for questions, but I'm also going to bring up the slide with additional links, right, to our help center and as well the community. But I assume if you're here in this presentation, you're probably already familiar with our community. Additionally, we do have a survey. So if you're interested in giving us some feedback about what you would like to see, we want to start small, right? With some introductory sessions, but based on your feedback and interest. We would like then to maybe organize follow-up sessions when we can drill down into more details about specific topics we're covering in our sessions. Okay, Dean, any questions? And you are on mute if you're trying to talk.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the only question we had in the chat window was from David Schmidt, who asked about if a SOAP API is not available in SMAX, is SMAX able to perform post-put actions to other interfaces? I put obviously a response back that we can do an outbound REST call or utilize other tools such as OO or even Connect IT to manage integrations if we need to do that.
Okay, great. Any other questions or feedback? Okay. So if there are no other questions, I think we can wrap up here. Thank you very much for attending, and we apologize again for the technical difficulties, and we're hoping to see you next time. Thank you. And thank you for the feedback.